All right, all right, all right, all right. Hello to everybody in South Africa. Hello to everybody in South Korea. Hello to everybody in Angola. We've got multiple countries here. My name is Vusi, and I have the pleasure of being today's host for Chapter 3 of the Keta webinar series titled Social Impacts of Wildlife Crime. People are also victims. Oh, this is definitely a hot topic for a hot day with the hottest people that I'm seeing today. So for those of you that are tuning in for the first time, the Keta webinar series seeks to improve media reporting on wildlife crime by inviting stakeholders, editors, journalists to take a deeper look at the wildlife crime and the realities around it. In the first Keta webinar, we learned that wildlife crime is entangled in the very fabric of our society, and it's definitely hard to beat. If it was, we would have beaten it by now. In the second chapter, good news that came from the Greater Kruger. We learned about the innovative collaborations that are having an impact in the Greater Kruger area. And today, we are here to discuss the fact that wildlife crime is just as much about people and how they live as it is about animals and plants. So veteran journalist who is here with us today, Eve van der Heugen, will lead the discussion together with our two amazing panelists, who is Dr. Annette Hupschel. I hope I pronounced it well. I'm still practicing my German. I only know Ich liebe dich and Ich vermisse dich. The rest, I'll get it. And Sbusiso Pakati, about how many people are often neglected and are victims of illegal wildlife trade in the Greater Kruger landscape. So without any waste of time, I would like to start by introducing our guest speakers and our host that will be co-driving this with me is today. But as we continue with the program, I would like to encourage you to keep introducing yourself on the chat box. Please tell us where you're tuning in from, your name and the organization that you are representing us from. So my co-driver that will be driving this webinar today is Mr. Eve van der Heugen, who is a former newspaper editor and media and cultural lecturer. So they say birds of the same feathers fly together. So hi, Foma. So I'm also with you on that boat today. And we also have Mr. Sboniso Pagati, who hails from Pietermaritzburg, KZN, and works as a project manager for the Rural Initiative for a Sustainable Environment Unit of the South African Wildlife College, SAWC in short. The initiatives are rooted in the Greater Kruger Spatial Region and focus on the social dimensions of conservation. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Sboniso, also known as Spoon. In Afrikaans would call you Lapel, in Sesotho, Lapola, in Stonga, Lepula. Welcome, Mr. Spoon. And then the second panelist that we have today, we've got Dr. Annette Hupschel, who is a Chief Research Officer at the University of Cape Town and known for her scholarship on wildlife crime and illicit economies. She oversees the Environmental and Planetary Future Research Group within the Global Risk Governance Program and leads several wildlife crime policy and conservation research projects. Wow, that's a mouthful. In short, she's somebody that's very knowledgeable and is an expert in a field. And Annette's expertise extends to teaching and supervising in the fields of illicit economies, wildlife crime, and community-based conservation. I am definitely looking forward to a productive and insightful discussion. This webinar will begin with Mr. Eves inviting our two panelists today, Sboniso and Annette, to share their insight, followed by an open Q&A session where you are welcome to ask questions via the chat box. So during the discussions, during the presentations from our panelists, please drop your questions in the chat. And after their presentation and discussion, we'll sure definitely to read your questions. So please be aware that this session is being recorded and will be available on the Jive YouTube channel. Those of you that don't know how to spell Jive, you spell it the same way you dance. That's why we've got good tunes. So this is where you can also catch up on dialogues that you may have missed. So continue to introduce yourselves and use the chat box for any questions at any time throughout the webinar. The questions for the panelists will be addressed later. So now I hand over to you, Mr. Eves. You may take it away.
Thanks, Vusi, for that exuberant introduction. And hi, Annette and Boniso. As Vusi mentioned, the premise of the Keta Story Project is to explore stories which perhaps people are not seeing in the media. So that presumes a certain lack in the media. And I might venture, just before I launch into the questions, just an observation on the media. I think quite often what one finds when a story isn't being covered is simply it might be too far away. And I think when one's dealing with rural stories, that is a dynamic when you're talking about metropolitan-based media largely. Sometimes the media don't know about it, and that's a problem of communication and people not necessarily either being sufficiently engaged with or trusting the media to bring their stories to the media. And then the other component, which is possibly most pertinent here, is when media report on an issue in a way which stokes, let's call it, moral panic. And I think to the extent that wildlife crime falls into the general category of crime, and South Africans are very exercised about crime in general, I think we probably see that a story that's being told in a rather dramatic way and with a particular emphasis is probably serving purposes other than the purposes of informing people about wildlife crime. So with those general observations, each of which we could talk about at length, I'd like to ask each of you, before we get into the more specific questions, and starting with you, Boniso, what would you like to be seeing reported on in a way which would tell a more rounded story, and which would allow people then to have a more let's call it productive engagement with the issue than perhaps they're having now?
Well, good afternoon, youth, and it's wonderful to share, a stage with all of you, including Dr. Hubschler, and thank you for the invitation. I think as a consumer, generally of news, written news media, sometimes video news, the charismatic terrestrial animals like rhinos, sometimes pangolin, and elephants are generally well reported about. And, getting to the other species that are perhaps less charismatic, you can talk about sharks, turtles, and the list goes on, smaller reptiles and exotic birds for the pet trade. Elements like that don't necessarily get the kind of reporting I think they should, receive as well. So it's kind of a bit of a feedback loop. The more you talk about it, the more attention it draws to it, and it creates an impression that this is the main problem. I think there are other elements as well which are equally important. Things like, illegal harvesting of, floral products, timber in Mozambique and South Africa, and up in the north of the park, things like mopane, which are in 2011 and 2022, during some of our work, we observed tons upon tons of wood being taken out of there and sold to larger markets, which I think is a big story to talk about, particularly because mopanes are important for, the cycle of mopane worms, or mopane trees are important. And so it's quite an important story to tell. And out of that comes a success story, in 2023, 2024, as we sort of move between the north of the park. This is Punda Maria, Pafuri area, Masisi community in particular. You can see a dramatic reduction, in the, the volume of illegally harvested wood in that area. And I think this is a success story to, agencies like the park, local conservation agencies like LEDIT, that include sort of inclusion and involvement of local communities. So out of this, I think there is a need to talk about the positive stories. There's a lot of, doom and gloom we see in the media. So I think some positive stories are quite important. Elements of community action and participation and finding solutions, even action at a very local scale. Problems seem too big for people to answer. And so I think solutions at scale are quite important to note. And I think elements of the why. I read a lovely article this morning by Lucas, I think it's Lucas Letwaba, great article talking about the poisoning in the Kruger Park. And I thought this is good storytelling. And the only thing I perhaps would have added there is a reason why it's so urgent for us to, to attend to the poisoning of vultures and of course the magnification thereof. So talking about like breeding rates, breeding habitats, gestation periods and the like. And I think survival rates of offspring and the ecological role that's played by particular species is important. There's an element of educating the reader. And I just wanted to add in that one problem, I think one challenge I see out of this is less traditional forms of media, social media, which creates an additional challenge because it's not governed by the same, code of ethics and values. And, people can write whatever. And so people are consuming news differently. But yeah.
Thanks, Bonisa. So what I'm hearing there is a little bit that people need to get to know the animals, first of all, and also need to know the people around the animals, secondly, and then put the two together and we might have a better picture. So thanks for that. Annette, what are you seeing or not seeing that you think is worth commentary?
Actually, Sibonisa has already sort of taken the floor quite well. Nearly everything I wanted to say, he said.
Okay.
But let me I think for me, in reading wildlife crime stories, what I often miss is engagement with actually people. So we don't hear from people directly impacted. So local community voices. We just hear about a rhino being poached, and then maybe some conservationist or rangers commenting on it. And I think it is quite important to get a sense, how are people impacted? What is happening at village or community level? How do people living with wildlife actually see poaching incidents and other forms of illicit harvesting going on? Then I often find, I think if you already touched on it, sort of the moral panic around wildlife crime and our general sense of insecurity, I suppose, in South Africa, but in other parts of the world as well, that we always sort of looking to securitize issues. And of course, we have seen some form of militarization in the responses to poaching and trafficking. But what I find is that the language used in newspaper reporting or general media reporting is also quite alarmist. So we often hear the notion of a war on poaching being used. And I think the sort of war language is not really helpful, especially when we want to work with communities, and communities want to be invested in fighting and disrupting wildlife crime as much as others. So if you're talking about fighting a war or taking the war to grassroots level, it's not really helpful. So I think that's my contribution. Yeah.
Thanks, Annette. Essentially, I suppose the explicit or implicit criminalization of communities is part of what happens when there's a them and us dynamic that gets either generated willfully or not willfully, but certainly another dimension to the issue, which is quite difficult to get a grip on. Thanks again. I'd like to move on to some more specific questions. Questions first to Siboniso, and then to paint a picture from the ground, so to speak, and then maybe a more academic and research-based response from Annette. Not to say that Siboniso doesn't do research, but those are your fields as I understand them. So Siboniso, I'm just going to list the three questions. We can come back to them if you don't need to take them down, but if you don't remember them, I'll repeat them. So the first is, you work in communities from Mozambique through to South Africa, and I think it's important to get an insight of the dynamics that pertain, given that they're not going to be the same from village to village, but there might be some broad sweeps that would help understand the setting. And then from that, if you could tell us from your experience what some anecdotes on the direct impact of wildlife crime and its ramifications on individuals and communities. And then finally, we're all interested in solutions. So if you had to venture a couple of solutions, you've touched on positive stories in your preamble, but perhaps if you could hone in on a couple of those. So over to you. You're on the ground. Tell us what it's like.
Wonderful. Thanks, Yves. I just wanted to note, which I didn't say in the beginning, is that in this engagement and I think this discussion, in no way do I speak on behalf of the communities or for the communities. And likewise, other views that I express, my own, informed by my perception or view of engagement with our work. So it's not necessarily those of Wildlife College. So I just wanted to note that. But with regards to our work in Mozambique, I mean, we're very fortunate as a unit to be established in 2015, be working in Mozambique and around the Kruger National Park in the western boundary. But starting in Mozambique, as a KZN Boyki, living in that environment and, visiting Mozambique for work, I think the first thing that struck me is hunger is a big issue in Mozambique, particularly, in the more northern regions, the more rural communities. Statistics tell us that there's about 46% of the population lives under the National Poverty Index, and they're surviving at about 38 Rand per month, 38 Rand per day, which really, I think in some cases is perhaps optimistic to say that, in the least. In some of the areas that we've worked along the N1, we've seen young children and girls sometimes, asking for bread. There's those kind of issues. There's the history of a 15-year war in Mozambique, which created a great amount of displacement of communities. And those kind of armed skirmishes didn't necessarily end with the end of the Civil War. So it continues, as we've seen in 2017 in the northern Cabo Delgado region. I think there are what I viewed as maybe regional economic disparities. So in the areas where there's, the big economic centers, supposed big economic centers, people tend to live a bit better than more in the rural areas. In the rural communities that we work in, there, which was a surprise to me to see, people who move from season to season, from areas that they're living in. They'll migrate between different conservative protected areas or kataras and the like. So, and I think a big driver around this is water insecurity, water and food insecurity, hunger, I would say. Malnutrition is quite an issue in those areas. And I think inadequate housing is also, one of those significant issues that sort of move people around. So I think with this in mind, and also just coupled with the awareness of, when people are moving from place to place, education will suffer, and capital will suffer. So there's really low levels of education in some of the areas that we work in. Many of the communities, in my experience, are living directly off the land, which is quite different from South Africa. There's activities like fishing, sometimes catching small animals, selling things like cashews and consuming cashews, farming for themselves, a bit of livestock, a bit of goats and the like. But charcoal is also quite a big industry. You see it along main roads. You see it between here and Rosano Garcia, which is, the central part of entry into Mozambique. And of course, selling fresh produce is one of the things they focused on. In this context, I think in Mozambique, direct livelihood intervention strategies seem more feasible, because people are living directly off the land. And, if you're changing behavior from fishing to, planting cashews, it might take a while for the cashews to grow, but it then produces income over a longer period. And so it's a very different context to South Africa. In my experience, in the north of the park, I experienced less populated areas. This is on the South African side. Less populated areas, more traditional communities, traditional homesteads. There's what I saw as a lot of cultural pride. I saw a bit in KwaZulu, but here there's a lot of cultural prides. We're the Tongas or we're above Venda, and there's pride. There's good relationship with land. I see as less of a contentious relationship between them and land. And I think the communities there seem to recognize and value and accept the more traditional forms of governance. I think youth unemployment is obviously prevalent throughout the western boundary of the park. And some of the main sources of income are things like farming, agriculture and crop farming, the ecotourism industry, and the supplementation by government social grants. So this is kind of the northern part. The southern and central is a bit more different in my experience, more densely populated. You could almost regard it as peri-urban. There's a couple million people living on the western boundary. But what I find, I imagine from the mind of the people living in those areas, is because they share this close proximity to these urban areas where there's access to other industries, there's that additional pressure of I need to have this. I need to, the material requirements. And many of the people are working in mines and, in farming and the like, and tourism, forestry, energy, and of course, there's elements of subsistence farming. What I see, I think, in the central and southern region is, I won't say less, but it's very different from the north. Perhaps in some ways I can say less. Less regard for the traditional systems of governance and more of a closer relationship to, the democratic systems of governance. And so I think that creates tension in itself, for local community leaders and conservation agencies that are engaging in that space, because the power of those local traditional governance systems or actors is often played up against democratic systems. So this would really be my view. And amongst the youth, I think another prevalent issues is, of course, alcohol use and drug abuse.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, you painting a picture where in Mozambique, the relationship with the land and with nature, and by definition, wildlife is more. It's part of the scenery, and therefore it's woven into life. Whereas maybe parts of the picture in South Africa are that it's at a remove, and so it's more of an opportunistic and commodity resource that people will then poach or whatever. So it's the definitions of what we're talking about are probably slightly differently emphasized in the one rather than as opposed to the other. So how do people actually then how does that manifest? So we talk about in the topic here, people are victims too of wildlife crime. So how is that manifesting itself?
I think I'd start by saying wildlife crime is one amongst many other, social issues that people and communities, I say communities and kind of use a bit loosely because the experience of where people are to vary from village to village, section and areas. So these impacts, I think, are quite, broad. And maybe I can summarize it at a household level, a systems level, and an element of, creating norms. I think at a systems level, there's a compromise of leadership. There's a compromise of governance structures, and at times a compromise of law enforcement actors in the space. Often coercion, violent coercion against families and the like. I think there's also an element of preying on communities. I think the word is cognitive justice. And which is a big. It's not yours. It's not yours. Why are you so protected? How do you benefit? Can you access in this? And historical legacy issues that Black communities still live with. I think there's also an element of systemic or systematic vulnerabilities that are often exposed. So between, the relationship between community and law enforcement agencies, community and government agencies, relationships between actual community members themselves and communities in conservation areas. An example of this is in the north, actually throughout the park, but particularly in the north and central parts, there's a program called the Environmental Monitor Program. These is composed of a group of young people representing different villages, and their focus is on ensuring or monitoring movement over, the boundary between park and the local neighboring communities. Generally, these people are seen as spies. And in other areas, law enforcement actors do have that constant threat of violence. They are exposed. Within the park, they're protected. In the communities, they're another general member. Yeah.
Sorry, are you still?
Yeah, I would have continued, but please do go ahead.
Okay, I'm conscious that we need to give Annette a shout in a little bit later. So yeah, you've touched twice now on positive dynamics, but so if one looks at the problem, it's extensive. We're talking about social problems, we're talking about political problems. What have you seen working apart from the instances that you've mentioned as a way that could then be scaled? Because obviously one's not looking just at a small initiative which then gets stopped in its tracks because it can't translate into into another area. What do you see working as something that we can hold on to in the long term?
Big question. And I think it'll be determined by the context. But sort of speaking generally, I think the fence in South Africa, fences, in conservative protected areas represent something. And, it's exclusion and the list goes on of all those negatives. So I think really starting with young people is critically important. Building those relationships, building a level of care, and enabling, facilitating entry into spaces and exposure to enhance understanding. And nature, I think, is something that speaks to us as people.
But whose job is that? When you say we must create relations, who creates the relationships?
I think everybody who is in these areas has a role to play. So, there's a conservation organizations, some bigger, some smaller, community-based organizations where I think relationships need to be built around this understanding. It's not necessarily only around illegal wildlife trade. It's around safety, environmental and social security of the spaces that we live in. And then we can have the conversation around, illegal wildlife trade. But going in there for that, people are dealing with issues like rape and, sometimes they don't have food, loss of their livestock, and the list goes on. So there's that element of all of us have a role to play in that. And in education, it doesn't just happen only in the school. It doesn't only happen in conservative protected areas. There's a vast space where, local Black communities are living. That's part of the ecosystem too. And it really needs to be protected, and it needs to be looked after, and it needs to be improved and enhanced to reduce some of those insecurities, those environmental insecurities. Government definitely has a role to play in this, yes, in provision of services, but also in demystifying a lot of these norms that are creeping into communities around what is acceptable and what is not. So it's an active role around these things. It's a tall ask, but they really do have a role. I think for our practitioners, I mean, it goes without saying, I think strong contextual understanding and legacies of the spaces that we find ourselves in, it really contributes to that respectful engagement, supporting strong, effective, and inclusive governance, and really ensuring that there is an equitable sharing of resources and benefits. And I would say for us as practitioners is this honest and consistent engagement with communities, and really, yeah, I'd say that. And I think decision making.
Yeah, that's a very sober and sobering observation that you make there. So thanks very much. Annette, on to you. First question I have for you is, how does an illicit economy come into being? This is your field. So how does the way I put the question is, how does a village act when crime comes to town, assuming that it's an external force as opposed to necessarily an internal dynamic?
So in terms of emergence of illicit economies, there are often different drivers. I think Sibusiso already quite rightly pointed out that, the economic drivers in South Africa, also in Mozambique, we have a long history of exclusion, people not being included in simple economic transactions and conservation. So in terms of just the emergence in some of the communities that I've visited was that you had young people being recruited into wildlife crime syndicates, and sometimes you have outsiders that move into communities to participate in illicit economies, so in poaching and other activities. How that impacts the community, there are lots of different impacts, but it's also, again, like it was said earlier, every community is different. So we cannot generalize and say, there's this specific impact that we see in every single community. We have sort of peri-urban neighborhoods in the south of Kruger. We have smaller villages on the Mozambican side. We have more sort of traditional community setups in other parts of northern South Africa. So the different impacts. What I observed, for example, like Sibusiso, I've spent a lot of time in Mozambique, and my first trip to look into wildlife crime was in 2012. And back then, I saw a lot of, very traditional sort of communities, villages, livelihoods, as earlier described. And then I went back just a year later, and by then rhino poaching had sort of increased, and you could see visible impacts of these poaching profits moving into a community. So whereas you didn't have spaza shops, you didn't have many bars and, just sort of kind of services, suddenly those were present. So, for example, this one village that I spent a lot of time in, suddenly had a nightclub, there were bars, there were sort of the things that we would usually associate with urban life. So there was, there were fast-moving consumer goods that were being traded. People were buying cell phones or sporting cell phones. Then sort of the more, let's call it the underbelly, there was sex work a lot more pronounced in some of the villages and towns. There was hard drug consumption. So these were some of the things that were observed and that I observed, but also others have been writing about. I see Fiona McLeod is on the call, and she had some really amazing newspaper reporting on what was going on as sort of rhino poaching profits moved into some of the communities. So not all of it was bad, of course, and I don't want to glorify the impact of wildlife crime. But some of the rhino kingpins, so-called rhino kingpins, they started spending some money on development. So especially in Mozambique, I would see some of the villages that I visited as lacking in public services. And I mean, we see that also outside the Kruger National Park, in some of our communities where you often have service delivery protests. So there are minimal public services that are being supplied by the state. So no running water, no clinics, the closest police station is often 100 kilometers away, those sort of things. And into this sort of space where there are very little services supplied, some of these rhino poaching kingpins and poachers moved in. And I know, for example, one rhino kingpin started sinking a borehole and supplied water to community members. Sometimes when poachers came back from successful hunts in Kruger National Park, they would slaughter a cow and, meat would be given to the community. So there's sort of, these small benefits to some community members. So not everybody saw wildlife crime or sees wildlife crime in a negative perspective necessarily, but that's also been changing over the years. On my most recent visit to Mozambique, I saw a lot of half-built houses, and I spoke to people, and it's essentially some of the poachers that have been arrested, some that have disappeared or that have died. So there are huge risks also attached to this wildlife crime for families and family members of poachers, rangers alike.
I suppose it's very difficult to argue against a dynamic where somebody looks up in the morning and says, okay, there's a direct correspondence between that resource and what's happening on my doorstep now. So, and where governance vacuums will obviously be stepped into by somebody or the other, whether it's the legitimate state or whether it's other agents. And that perspective of how to view what's going on around you. I was struck in our sort of preliminary discussions by an anecdote that you shared about how the massive resources that are devoted to, for example, rhino protection, how that dynamic is viewed by some. And I wonder if you could share that with us and talk about how entrenched it is, or whether it's just one anecdote which particularly struck you.
I think that's a very good question. Again, just to say, I can't generalize about what I'm talking about. I mean, a lot of my work is qualitative, but there are some principles that one can derive from what I've seen. And so one anecdote that I told Eve and some others linked to the earlier was about a focus group that I held in the Greater Kruger. I'm not going to give more details as to where, but in essence, I wanted to find out more about perceptions about wildlife conservation by community members. So I was sitting in a circle with about 10 people, and I just asked, what does the rhino actually mean to you? Have you ever seen a rhino? And what do you think about rhino protection? And basically, people were sort of started talking, and they were saying to me, well, you know what, we have not seen the rhino, but we know of the rhino, and the rhino has better services than us. And so in essence, people were saying, you know, a rhino has a ranger, a police officer, the rhino has land, a doctor that looks after it. And we don't have these things. And maybe if this rhino goes extinct, maybe we can finally get those things. And I think that was one of the biggest aha moments that I had about the disconnect that we have in terms of wildlife conservation and not actually bringing directly impacted people on board. So these were people that were living right next to the fence line, had never seen a rhino. And they felt that the rhino was being looked after much better, in a much better manner than they were. And I think this is basically where we at fault in a way, the whole of society. So I agree that, it's not up to Kruger National Park or some conservation organization to address these issues, how to bring in local communities or how to deal with conservation issues. We've been talking about this being a whole of society issue. So basically all hands on deck. So everybody has to assist in some way or manner. And in essence, it has to be consultative, and we cannot preach and say this is how conservation should work, but we need to look at how to bring people in, and also very important to provide livelihood options. So yes, there are some people that have benefited in part from illicit economies. How do you bring them on board? By providing licit or livelihood opportunities. And of course, Kruger National Park cannot provide jobs or direct benefits to everyone living on its border. I think I haven't seen the latest census figures as yet, but the last census figures talked about 3.5 million people living on the western boundary of the Kruger National Park. So that is a lot of people. So the Kruger National Park or rhinos or wildlife cannot provide incentives or benefits to everyone living on its boundaries. But we can, as a society, we can look at other rural development opportunities, bring in people, and it is really talking about these broad-based economic transformative activities that we need to start rolling out in rural communities. And just to say, I've been doing a lot of work in the Northern Cape of late, where there's another poaching crisis going on at the moment. There's illicit succulent harvesting going on. And I've also been speaking there to people that are involved in the harvesting, but also people directly impacted by it. And there's also quite a big disconnect where people don't have services, there are no livelihood opportunities. And something that kept on coming up is it should not be illegal to pick a plant. And that I've heard a lot in my research around Kruger National Park as well, where a lot of people were saying to me, well, this used to be our land. We were allowed to move around on the land, hunt a buck or, access water, fish. And nowadays, that's no longer possible. But we need to look at how to bring in people into the conservation into conservation, and how to, how to benefit people. So I think
and I suppose, as you say, it's a broad society issue. So we can't look to conservationists and say, okay, well, you solve the problem of how people relate to wildlife and and it's just going to be magicked into being. And for as long as the economy remains an abstraction, I imagine that's a dynamic that's going to be a thorny one to deal with. Thanks very much, Annette. I think we've got to the point where we're going to field questions from the audience. Vusi, can I hand back to you from here?
Yeah, thank you very much. Whew. I'm just sitting here just from listening to the discussions and the points that you guys are raising. And it is really a mammoth topic. And there's some questions that people have been dropping in the chat, and I'll be asking to both of you. And one of you that is ready to answer can just jump in. The first question is to both speakers, what would you say are the key changes that should be made to our conservation model in South Africa, specifically that could help mitigate wildlife crime? Bonisa, see you ready?
Oh my goodness, I'll hand this one over to Dr. Hopschler.
Doc, any views?
If we had the solutions, so I think, you know, a first step would be to be a lot more inclusive in what we do. And I think you talked about it earlier, Sabinisa, like when you said, you know, this notion of fences. And I often feel that conservation in South Africa is still a very lily white affair. Look at me. No, but you know, it's in essence, we really need to start talking with people directly impacted. And, you know, we haven't even touched on human-wildlife conflict and other issues that impact local communities living close to parks. So I think we need to sort of start learning some of the lessons. I might have a German surname, but I grew up in Namibia, and Namibia has this community conservancy model, which has been working fairly well. There have been issues as well, but you know, the idea is that communities actually run their own conservation areas and they benefit from it. Which obviously with a population of 3.5 million people and counting around Kruger National Park is not viable. And you know, Namibia also has national parks. But let's look at models of how to actually have a conversation and include people. And, you know, beyond conservation, let's look at rural development initiatives and livelihoods. I think it's really, really important. Other issues, I think, you know, I think we talked about it earlier, community safety. So we're providing wildlife safety, but what about safety of communities? I do remember I did conduct a very short study for Keta a few years ago, and we looked at, you know, security and safety issues that were impacting communities living close to wildlife. And there were a lot of concerns. So we have a duty of care to also have, you know, make sure that our communities are safe. You know, there are high levels of gender-based violence. There were other issues, rape, murder, the typical South African story. So let's have safe communities and safe wildlife and have conversations about, you know, livelihoods and how to include everyone.
So if I'm hearing you well, the answer to environmental problems and challenges is actually not environmental. They are social, they are economical, and it requires even us conservationists to go beyond the conservation line. Okay, very interesting. And Spoon, earlier on when you started, you spoke about some of these high value species that are well recorded and mostly reporting about, but there's also been an issue of saying that every time you report on something, you're actually drawing attention to it. Which also increases wildlife crime. So how would you then advise many of the journalists that are here today to report, and what type of information or in what way should they put it in such a way that it will bring value both to the communities receiving this information and also to the conservation areas that are faced with these challenges?
Sure. So, yeah, I think it's a challenging question to respond to a bunch of professionals, but I think, you know, the field of journalism from an external point of view, I think especially with written media, etc., you want to sell the story, you want to tell the facts, and in some cases there's a use of emotive language which, you know, enhances reader engagement with your content, reading your article through. It's a challenge. And earlier, I'd mentioned to try and unpack the underlying complexities leading up to the story that we're telling. For example, we look, just in the western boundary in the Kushu area, there's the stories around Kruger as a landscape of fear. We heard about the issues of governance structures being, compromised severely, and some of the people with formal roles of governance and decision making participating in illegal activity, and cash and transits and ATM bombings. That is, fear, and the only response to that is anger. So it's this kind of all I can say is I recognize the challenge, and they are walking a tightrope. But it really is to present the underbelly, the underlying facts that really contribute to what it is that we're looking at. It was inevitable. I think it is, we tell the story of save the rhino because there's only so many left, high value species. A person with nefarious intent looks at that and says, this is an opportunity. And I think those elements will always be there. You can't do away with how people listen.
Yeah, and I mean, talking about that, earlier on, we've been using the word moral panic that has been created around the world of crime. Again, looking at some of the mental walls that are around there. And then you've looked at the increase of rhino poaching that has escalated over the past 10 years. You also have framings such as them and versus us and stuff like that, where there's an exclusion or separation in terms of framing wildlife crime. Do you guys think that that narrative has changed in the landscape or shifted in recent years? And if so, do you know that what led to that shift?
My first bit of engagement with this, we'll see before Dr. Hupschler jumps in, was at one of our Keta webinars, one of the Keta meetings with Dr. Lindy. I don't know if she's on the line today, but she, in that session, they really highlighted something that I'd felt internally. And that was, yes, it was alarmist reporting. It is an appeal to people's, emotions and their morals. And generally the people that they were speaking to, just based on the history of South Africa, most of our white conservationists had served, in the military and the army. And so it's that it falls into that fray of like, in my view, the Swat Hafar and all of that kind of stuff. And so it's very easy to get behind that. It's like, it's our land. We need to protect these animals, etc. But I would say, from my view, in the past sort of 8 years or so, 5 years, there has been a significant shift. And my view on this is there's been a lot more social scientists in this space, and a lot more, and of course, I'm not putting social scientists against like, natural scientists and law enforcement or resource protection and all the like. Everybody's, plays an equally important role, and perhaps that is what was needed at the time to get people's attention. I'm not sure, but I think the inclusion of social scientists was critical. They asked the why and what if, and have you considered this, and, things are often a bit more deeper and systemic, and it's really contributed to putting community right up at the forefront. In some cases, communities are seen as being apathetic. In some cases, they're harboring, criminal elements. In some cases, they are part of the problem. In some cases, they are seen as the first line of defense. In some cases, they're seen as custodians. In all of this, what social scientists helped us to understand, there's complexity, regardless of how you see, people. So it's really brought that to the forefront, and that would be my bit of contribution there.
All right, cool. Anything to add there, Doc?
I suppose I can just observe that there probably has been a bit of a social turn, for lack of a better word or description. I think, yes, there were more social scientists and critical thinkers that moved into the space, but also within conservation itself. I mean, I know that within Kruger National Park, there's some amazing people doing really, really good work in terms of reaching out and working with communities. So it's not just, the critical thinkers and the social scientists that have made changes, but there has been a big change in conservation thinking, which is absolutely amazing. And I think we need to kind of really appreciate that this is happening. I think it's, I remember arriving in Kruger National Park, and I was the first social scientist to do research on rhino poaching back in 2013. And I remember signing a research contract. You know, we all have to get permits to do research in parks. And it was a contract for natural scientists because they'd never seen this animal of a social scientist in the Kruger National Park. And that has changed. It has changed a lot. And, you know, I was at a conference in Kruger National Park a month ago, and actually the food and services were supplied by local community members, which would not have been possible 10 years ago. So I think we are seeing changes. And just in terms of, you know, the sort of war, I saw Lindy Butter ask a question earlier about, you know, has the moral panic changed a bit? It most certainly has. I think people did wake up to, you know, it is really not very positive to talk about a war against people, war on poaching or the rhino wars, or, you know, there have been all sorts of framings. And I think if you want to invite people into conservation, you have to, you know, you have to use different language. I do remember some years back, I was asked to do a presentation in Parliament, and our late minister was there, and we were talking about, you know, how the rhino poaching strategy had worked, and, you know, how to move things forward. And one of my comments was that it was really not helpful to use the language of war, which had failed. I mean, we know about the failed war on drugs, and, you know, that kind of, to invoke that language is not helpful. I haven't seen that language in any official correspondence from our government or from Kruger. So I think there have been great changes.
Okay, cool. And with respect to time, I'm going to give you guys 1 minute each. Literally 1 minute. I know you're preachers like myself and we get very passionate. But starting with you, Spoon. So what has led a Maritzburg College boy to go from KZN to the Kruger landscape? And to you, Anita, what led you to do work in the Kruger landscape, and what was your first Kruger-related research? So just a closing remark on that, just we get to know you a little bit better. 1 minute, here you go.
Goodness me, closing remark, which starts the story. Anyway, my move to the Lowveld was a bit mixed. You know, KZN, lots of post-apartheid issues. Typically, it was actually violence that really was a prompt for me. Very long story, but within the family and the areas that we lived in, I had to move. But also, prior to sort of getting home for that 2-month period, I'd been on a trip abroad, and in my sort of wishful thinking on our trip to Europe, I thought I'd like to work in the real Africa, you know, and experience what it's like to work in the hinterland. Retrospect, it's laughable. I'm African. I'd been living and working in Africa. But it is, yeah, I think arriving here was really an eye-opener to what else is available, to the beauty that's in our country, what is really available to us as our common heritage, and something that is of our common heritage, you know, as Africans, regardless of where you come from. It's a big part of who we are. And so, you know, I stayed and worked through various organizations, and here we are.
That's very, very much evident African time. Anita, 1 minute, closing remark.
1 minute, oh my God, starting now. I suppose I got drawn into this, you know, in my former career, I was a researcher on organized crime and money laundering issues on the African continent. So quite hardcore security. And about 13 years now ago, I decided to do a PhD, and I needed to find a good topic. And then I remembered this one day in 2010 when I was invited to a roundtable on dehorning and rhino horn trade legalization that was organized by a South African NGO. And I had never in my life seen such a colorful selection of people that were fighting and shouting at each other. And I just thought, well, you know, this is a good space to be in because there's a lot of room for discussion and obviously also peacemaking and coming up with interesting solutions. And here I am.
I can definitely see that in you because, you know, you look like somebody who would fit in very well in a James Bond movie or Tom Cruise movie, doing all the hardcore spying and the groundwork. But thank you very much. So thank you very much to all the insightful questions that all our participants have dropped in the chat. Thank you very much. So we have to wrap up. So I want to express my thanks to you, Eve. Lovely. engageful discussions and topics. Thank you very much, Siboniso. Hope you stay in the landscape. And Aneta, thank you very much for your valuable input, significant contribution to this important topic. Also to WWF South Africa and USAID for making this opportunity available. You can find out more about the Keta project at the link in the chat. It has been shared there. You can click there, follow up, or you can actually follow them on the social media platforms. We do have a webinar series, and we are having our next Chapter 4 Keta webinar somewhere around in May. So be on the lookout for that space. Please follow all the social media channels to get more information on when the next one is going to be. If you've missed any of the past ones, check on YouTube and like and follow. So those of you that have taken the time to be here, once again, thank you for your participation. Looking forward to welcome you on the next webinar. Maybe you might be the host, and some of the journalists out there looking forward to reading your stories in social media, in your blogs, in your newspapers. Tag us in. We'd like to hear more and follow what you guys are busy on. Thank you very much. And everybody keep doing the amazing work that you're doing. After all, it's all our responsibility. Have a lovely day ahead and lovely week ahead.